Welcome back, everyone,
It's great to be back.
for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history,
Really a key period.
especially if you're gearing up for the UPSC exam,
Absolutely.
but really anyone who's just fascinated by Indian history.
For sure, yeah.
Today, we're focusing on the era of Lord Wellesley.
A figure who really changed the game.
And don't forget to hit that subscribe button
And like the episode.
so you don't miss any future deep dives.
We have a lot more coming up.
So last time we were talking about the East India Company
Right.
and their early kind of cautious involvement in India.
At least initially.
Then Lord Wellesley arrives in 1798.
Changes everything.
It's like stepping onto a whole new game board.
Completely different player, yeah.
And his predecessor, Sir John Shore,
Right.
followed this policy of non-intervention.
Yeah.
But Wellesley, totally different vision.
He wanted to establish British paramountcy.
To make it clear, they were the dominant power.
No question about it.
It's like two totally different approaches clashing.
Head on. And that clash is really embodied in the Subsidiary Alliance system.
This Subsidiary Alliance system
It was Wellesley's big idea.
sounds simple at first glance.
Like a treaty. Right.
Between the British and the Indian rulers.
Right.
But I feel like there's more to it than that,
Oh, absolutely.
especially given Wellesley's ambition.
Yeah, it was a clever way for them to extend their influence without going to war every time.
Right.
But for Indian rulers, there was a cost.
What did they have to agree to?
Well, they had to accept a British resident at their court.
Like a watchdog almost.
Kind of, yeah. And they had to pay for a British-trained army.
So they were funding their own, basically, occupation.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But most importantly, they couldn't make alliances with other Indian powers.
So they're giving up their autonomy
Yeah.
in exchange for this protection.
It definitely wasn't a fair deal.
I can see how this could lead to resentment.
Oh, definitely. It fueled a lot of anti-British sentiment.
And think about it from the perspective of the people living under these rulers.
Right, seeing their own leaders becoming more and more reliant on a foreign power.
It's not just military strength.
It's about control. Control at every level.
And there were real-world examples of this subsidiary alliance system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
In action. The first ruler to accept it.
Who was that?
The Nizam of Hyderabad.
Okay.
First in 1798,
And that...
and then again in 1800.
Wow.
Huge win for Wellesley. Gave them a foothold in the South.
I see.
And a precedent for other rulers.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly.
So you've got the subsidiary alliance system.
Setting the stage for British expansion.
But this period isn't just about treaties and alliances.
No.
There's a lot of conflict brewing.
There is.
The Second Anglo-Maratha War.
From 1803 to 1805.
And what's interesting is the backdrop to that war.
Right, you had the Maratha Confederacy, which was this powerful force in India.
Right.
But now they're riddled with internal conflicts.
You've got Holkar
The Peshwa Baji Rao II,
and Scindia
all vying for power.
creating this very volatile situation.
Ripe for intervention.
And it seems like Wellesley was a master of taking advantage of those divisions.
He saw an opportunity and he took it.
And a key turning point in this conflict.
The Peshwa Baji Rao II, he's defeated by Jaswant Rao Holkar in 1802.
Okay.
He's forced to flee, seeks protection from the British,
He's desperate.
signs the Treaty of Bassein,
Which basically makes him a puppet ruler.
under British control,
So not only individual rulers,
but entire power structures being weakened and manipulated.
it wasn't just about winning battles.
It was about reshaping the political landscape of India.
And this brings us to a figure who really resisted this manipulation.
Tipu Sultan of Mysore.
Tipu Sultan.
We talked about him last time. Formidable opponent. Fought the British in 3 previous wars.
Right. And Wellesley saw him as a major threat
Absolutely.
to his grand vision.
To his whole plan.
I can only imagine Wellesley's reaction to Tipu Sultan's defiance,
He was not happy.
trying to establish this system of control.
And here's Tipu Sultan saying no.
Must have been incredibly frustrating.
Infuriating, probably. But Wellesley was a strategist.
So what did he do?
He knew direct confrontation with Tipu Sultan would be risky.
Right.
So he played the long game,
Okay.
secured the neutrality of the Marathas and the Nizam before attacking Mysore.
Isolating Tipu Sultan,
Brilliant move.
removing potential allies.
Setting the stage for the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799.
Wow, it's like 4D chess.
He was always thinking ahead.
And this war culminates in the siege of Seringapatam,
Tipu Sultan's capital.
and he's killed defending his city.
A tragic end.
It's the end of independent Mysore rule.
And further solidified British supremacy in southern India.
It's a defining moment in Wellesley's quest for paramountcy.
Sends a clear message to the rest of India. Resistance is futile.
But Wellesley's ambition didn't stop at military conquests.
Oh, no.
He also wanted to control the narrative.
How people perceived British rule.
That's where his efforts to control the press come in.
The Press Act of 1799.
It's always fascinating to see how power dynamics play out, not just on the battlefield.
But in the world of ideas and information?
And I'm guessing Wellesley wasn't a big fan of free speech.
Especially if it threatened his authority.
So what did this act do?
It required newspapers to be screened by the government before publication.
Basically, censorship.
Basically, they could censor anything critical.
So it wasn't enough to conquer territory.
He wanted to conquer minds.
Wow. It shows the extent of his control.
Absolutely.
He wanted to ensure the dominance of the British narrative.
He wanted to tell the story his way.
And he really had a vision for British India.
He did.
He pursued it relentlessly.
He did.
But even the most ambitious figures face setbacks.
And Wellesley was no exception.
His constant expansion.
Military campaigns.
Expensive.
They started to raise concerns back in London.
The East India Company was feeling the financial strain.
Yeah.
It seems like his ambition might have gotten the best of him.
It might have. His policies eventually led to his recall in 1805.
He was recalled.
The court of directors, the ones in charge of the East India Company,
Right.
they decided they needed someone more cautious.
Someone who wouldn't spend so much money.
Exactly. So they replaced him with Sir George Barlow.
A more conservative approach.
Much more cautious.
Almost ironic.
Yeah.
This man who reshaped the political landscape of India.
He implemented so many changes.
Ultimately undone by his own ambition.
Yeah, happens.
But even though his time in India was short,
Relatively.
his impact was felt for generations.
For sure. His legacy lived on.
Yeah, it's amazing how these actions, he was focused on the present, but they had this huge impact, really changed the trajectory of British involvement in India.
It's true. And when we talk about Wellesley's legacy, that Subsidiary Alliance system,
Front and center.
you can't ignore it. UPSC aspirants, they need to understand this deeply. It seemed simple on paper.
But in the long run, how did it actually play out?
Well, we talked about these agreements. They seemed straightforward, but over time it became really clear the true nature of these alliances. They were chipping away, bit by bit, at the autonomy of these Indian states.
They weren't able to conduct their own foreign policy.
Right.
They had to pay for these armies.
Owned by the British, right?
Yeah, there was always that British resident
Yeah.
watching their every move.
Always there, lurking in the background. It created this dependence.
Like they needed the British for their survival.
For their security, yeah. And this is a classic example of how subtle forms of political control, they can be just as effective.
Maybe even more so.
Than just outright conquest.
It's a crucial point, I think, for people studying this period, especially for that UPSC exam.
Absolutely.
What must that have been like for these rulers? To have your power slowly eroded like that, to be constantly under the watchful eye of this foreign power.
It must have been incredibly demoralizing. And that sense of demoralization coupled with the resentment among the people, seeing their leaders, losing their authority.
It creates a breeding ground.
For unrest.
And how widespread was this subsidiary alliance system? I mean, how many rulers were pulled into it?
Oh, it was far-reaching. We talked about Hyderabad.
First one.
And then Mysore after Tipu Sultan. But it didn't stop there. You have these key Maratha leaders, the Peshwa, Scindia, even Holkar eventually. It spread across huge parts of India.
A huge chunk is the subcontinent.
Under this system of indirect British rule, you could say, and the ramifications of that, they were enormous. The balance of power in India, it totally shifted. The British, through the system, they become the dominant force.
And these Indian states, they were once powerful.
In their own right.
They're now subordinate allies. It's a stark illustration of how a peaceful strategy
seemingly peaceful
has such profound consequences.
Yeah.
It's almost like, I don't know, a spider web. The British at the center.
Yeah.
And they're slowly entrapping these Indian states.
That's a great analogy. That really captures what was happening. And as the 19th century goes on, that web, it just gets tighter and tighter. Wellesley's successors, some are cautious, some even more aggressive. They keep expanding this system. British dominance, it's just solidified.
So even though Wellesley's recalled in 1805, he's gone.
Right.
His presence is still there.
It looms large over British policy in India. You could argue that his real legacy, his most lasting impact, wasn't the expansion. It was this system of control, this intricate web It defined the relationship between the British and the Indian states for decades to come.
For generations.
Generations, yeah. And for those preparing for the UPSC, it's not just about the events.
Right.
It's about understanding those long-term consequences.
Not just memorizing dates and names.
It's about analyzing those strategies, the motivations behind them, the impact on the course of Indian history.
Like peeling back the layers of this complex puzzle.
Trying to see the bigger picture.
Yeah. And Wellesley's ambitions, they weren't just about the battlefield or politics.
No.
He wanted to shape the social and cultural landscape of British India.
He did.
I remember reading about his educational reforms.
He was a big believer in establishing a system of education in India. He thought it was crucial for the administration of the colony.
I mean, he needed capable people.
To help him govern this vast and complicated land.
But it wasn't just practicality, was it?
No, there was this idea of civilizing the Indian population.
A classic colonial idea.
Right, bringing enlightenment to the so-called uncivilized masses. But we need to look at that with a critical lens, understand the power dynamics. Wellesley, like many others at the time, he genuinely believed in the superiority of European culture and education. He saw it as a way to instill those British values into Indian society.
It's a reminder that even policies that seem well-intentioned
On the surface.
can be tools of control.
Absolutely, especially in a colonial context. And for UPSC prep, it's important to analyze these things from multiple perspectives. What were the motivations? How did these reforms impact existing systems in India? The long-term consequences. Lots to consider.
So what do these initiatives look like? I mean, were they successful?
Well, one of Wellesley's most ambitious projects was Fort William College in Calcutta.
Fort William College.
It was meant to train young British civil servants
in
Indian languages, law, culture, preparing them for a career in administration.
So he's trying to create these British officials who are not just rulers, but also scholars of Indian culture.
To some extent, yeah, it's a really interesting mix, pragmatism and, you could say, intellectual curiosity.
But his vision wasn't just about training those British officials.
No.
He also wanted to create schools.
Across India, to reach more of the Indian population.
But those plans, they faced pushback.
From the East India Company back in London?
They were focused on profits.
Trade, yeah. I'm sure they didn't want to spend money on education.
Probably saw it as an unnecessary expense.
Exactly, a drain on their resources. But Wellesley, he argued that a well-educated civil service, it would be more effective in governing India.
And ultimately benefit the company.
In the long run.
It's like this clash of ideologies.
You have Wellesley's vision, this culturally engaged administration.
And the company.
Much more focused on profit.
It reflects this bigger debate.
That was going on within the British establishment at the time. What was the nature of their rule in India? Were they just there to take resources and control things? Or was there this responsibility to uplift, to civilize the Indian population?
Those are questions that historians are still debating.
Still analyzing, yeah. And for those getting ready for the UPSC, these debates, they offer really valuable insights into the complexities of colonialism, the different perspectives that shaped those policies.
Wellesley's efforts to control the press, his focus on education, it all shows this desire to exert influence.
Not just through military might.
But by shaping Indian society.
Absolutely. He was incredibly ambitious. He believed in the superiority of British culture. He wanted to leave his mark on India. But as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, his ambition, it led to his downfall. His grand visions, all the expansion, it came at a cost. And the East India Company, they weren't willing to pay it anymore. You know, it's funny how these efforts to shape Indian society through education, driven by this idea of British superiority, they kind of inadvertently created this platform for intellectual exchange and debate. Fort William College, with its focus on Indian languages and culture, some British scholars, they actually developed this renewed interest in Indian intellectual tradition.
Almost the opposite of what he intended.
In a way, yeah, trying to impose British culture.
And it sparked a revival
of interest in Indian heritage.
It's a pretty fascinating twist.
History is rarely straightforward. Actions have unintended consequences, you could say.
That's true. And speaking of unintended consequences, maybe, let's go back to that Press Act of 1799.
Okay, yeah.
We talked about it a bit earlier, but it's worth looking at it a bit more closely.
I agree.
Especially for those UPSC exams.
Yeah.
Censorship, freedom of expression, those themes come up.
They do. And remember, this was a time of huge upheaval globally. You had the French Revolution, it just shook Europe. And the American colonies, they break away from British rule.
Successfully.
Successfully, yeah. I'm sure these events, they made Wellesley nervous
Hmm.
about any kind of dissent in India.
Anything that could threaten British authority.
Exactly.
So he was trying to prevent any uprising.
Stop them before they start. He saw the press as this powerful tool,
Or spreading ideas.
which could lead to rebellion.
A double-edged sword.
Exactly. It could be used to spread information, promote British policies, but it could also be used to criticize those policies. They mobilize people against them. And
Yeah.
Wellesley, he was all about control, maintaining order. That was a risk he couldn't take.
And it shows this anxiety, I think, within the British establishment
Yeah.
about the stability of their empire.
Yeah.
Challenges everywhere.
Internal and external.
So controlling information
Public discourse.
becomes really important.
Absolutely essential. The Press Act, it was a clear attempt to silence those dissenting voices, make sure the British narrative, it was the only one. And even some British officials, they thought it went too far,
Too harsh.
too controlling. And while it was eventually relaxed under later governors general, it set this precedent for press restrictions.
That continued throughout the colonial period.
In one form or another, yeah.
So it wasn't just this one-time thing. It was a shift.
In how they approached governing India.
It's a move toward authoritarianism, control. Dissent wasn't something to discuss. It was a threat.
To be neutralized.
And for our listeners, those UPSC folks, think about the long-term consequences of this. How did this impact public discourse? Did it create a culture of fear, self-censorship? How did it affect the growth of Indian nationalism, which, was a reaction to this control?
In many ways, yeah.
It's amazing how events like this, they can have such a huge impact. The Press Act, shaping a nation's development, its struggle for independence.
It's all interconnected.
And Wellesley's legacy, it's a mixed bag, full of these contradictions. He was ambitious, a visionary. He really set the stage for British dominance.
He did.
But those policies, his expansion, his desire for control, ignoring dissenting voices, it created this resentment, this resistance.
That ultimately led to the end of the British Raj.
It was a key player.
In this story of British colonialism in India.
It's fascinating and, deeply troubling. As we wrap up our deep dive into his era, I encourage you, our listeners, keep exploring.
Read those sources.
Analyze, think about it. Come to your own conclusions. History isn't just facts and dates. It's alive. It's about interpretation, debate. It's ongoing.
It changes as we learn more.
I hope this deep dive, it was helpful. For our UPSC folks, anyone interested in Indian history, this pivotal period.
Absolutely. It's about engaging with the past, those critical questions, making connections to the present, understanding those forces that shape societies, and those legacies, how they endure, for better or worse.
Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of Lord Wellesley. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this episode with your friends. We'll be back soon with another chapter in the story of India. Keep learning, keep questioning, keep exploring.